the thunder of 1,000 hooves, the roar of a charging army, the absolute power of a living God on earth. For centuries, the might of the Egyptian pharaoh was measured by the speed and strength of his chariot corps. A single chariot could turn the tide of battle, a force of nature made of wood, leather, and bronze. We imagine pharaohs and warriors as the source of this power. But what if the true masters of the battlefield were not the men holding the reins, but a secretive guild of craftsmen, whose sacred art has been utterly lost to time? What if the secret to building an empire was a secret they took to their graves? A secret that began not with a hammer, but with a prayer? Their name, when translated, was the circle shapers of Amun. They were not mere carpenters, they were mystics, initiates of a craft so revered that their workshops were treated as temples. To shape a wheel was to shape the fate of Egypt itself. They worked in seclusion, their methods passed down from master to apprentice through whispered words and silent demonstration. The pharaoh could command any man, but he could only request the service of a circle shaper. Their process began deep in the fertile lands bordering the desert, with a search for a very specific tree. They weren't looking for the strongest oak or the most pliable ash. They were looking for something else, a timber imbued with a spirit, a life force that they alone knew how to harness. But the wood they used, it wasn't just any timber. It was something else entirely, something that modern science still struggles to explain. They called it the Izd tree, a plant spoken of in myth, often associated with the gods Thoth and Seshat, deities of wisdom and writing. Scholars today believe it may have been a type of Persea, but the shaper's descriptions speak of a wood that was impossibly light, yet stronger than bronze when treated. It grew only in sacred groves, and a priest had to sanctify the tree before it could be felled, reading its future in the patterns of its leaves. Once cut, the raw timber was transported under guard, not to the workshop, but to the banks of the Nile. There, it was submerged in the sacred river for one full lunar cycle. A ritual baptism to wash away the trauma of its felling and reawaken its spirit. Finding a suitable Izd tree was a quest in itself. But the true challenge, the first step of their ritual, began only after it was felled. For the wood, they believed, was dead, and a dead wheel could never carry the living. After its baptism in the Nile, the wood was brought to the hallowed workshop. Here, the true art began. The logs were cut into segments, not with brute force, but with careful, prayerful precision, following the grain as if reading a sacred text. The goal was to create the felloes, the curved sections that form the circumference of the wheel. The technique for bending these segments was the guild's most guarded secret. They used steam, yes, but they called it the breath of Ra, a life-giving vapor that softened the wood's spirit, making it receptive. A master shaper would chant as he worked, coaxing the wood into a perfect arc, feeling for the precise moment of submission. This process took months, but it was nothing compared to the next step, the shaping. They didn't just bend the wood, they had to convince it to bend. And for that, they needed a tool that wasn't made of bronze or stone. The tool was sound, the tool was instinct. As the wood bent in the whispering steam, the craftsman would listen. He would listen for a change in the wood's internal structure, a sigh of release that told him it had accepted its new form. Once bent, it was locked into a jig to cure for another 6 months, absorbing the dry desert air until it was hard as stone but light as a feather. Spokes, carved from the same sacred tree, were then fitted into the central hub. The tolerances were so fine that a single hair could prevent a perfect fit. They used no metal fasteners, only the tension and pressure of the wood itself. Each wheel was a unique creation, a dialogue between man and material. But a single wheel is useless. The true artistry, the secret that baffled Egypt's enemies, was in creating its perfect twin. A chariot requires 2 wheels, not just similar in size and weight, but identical in spirit. The circle shapers believed that an imbalanced pair would pull the chariot towards chaos and death. So, they didn't simply build 2 wheels, they coaxed a single soul into 2 bodies. They would take 2 hubs, 2 sets of spokes, 2 sets of felloes, all cut from the same Izd tree, and work on them simultaneously. Every cut on one was mirrored on the other. Every prayer whispered over one was repeated for its twin. This wasn't manufacturing, it was a birth. But how do you measure a soul? How do you ensure 2 separate objects share a single spiritual essence? The answer lay not in a ruler, but in a sound. When both wheels were fully assembled, the final test of harmony would begin. The master shaper, in the dead of night when the world was silent, would take a small, soft mallet made of acacia wood and lightly tap a spoke on the first wheel. It would produce a clear, resonant tone. He would then move to the second wheel and tap the corresponding spoke. The two notes had to be identical, not just close, but a perfect unison. If they were even slightly off, the wheels were considered disharmonious and the entire process would begin again. They called this the Song of the Wheel, a sacred duet that confirmed the wheels shared one spirit. Once the two wheels sang the same note, they were considered bound, but the process was far from over, because now, they had to face their greatest test, a trial by fire that would either sanctify their creation or shatter it into splinters. This was not a trial of open flame, but of intense, controlled heat. The paired wheels were placed in a kiln, a chamber dug into the desert floor, and baked for 3 days and 3 nights. This process, known as tempering, locked the wood's shape permanently and drew out the last of the sacred Nile's moisture, crystallizing the wood's internal structure into something new. It was a moment of immense risk. Any hidden flaw, any microscopic crack or imperfection in the wood, would expand in the heat and the wheel would burst apart. More than half of all wheels created were lost at this stage, returning to dust as the shapers watched and chanted prayers for the departed spirit. This hardening process was what made the wheels legendary, but it also introduced a fatal flaw, a spiritual imbalance that, if left uncorrected, could cause the chariot to veer towards the land of the dead in the heat of battle. The intense heat, they believed, made the wheels strong but spiritually thirsty. To quench this thirst and restore balance, the final ritual was performed. A priest of Amun would be summoned to the workshop. He would bring a small vessel containing a mixture of blessed water from the Nile's first flood and a single drop of lion's blood. Symbolizing courage, with a reed brush, he would paint a hieroglyph on the inner face of the wheel's hub, a symbol known only to the guild and the priesthood. This mark was the final blessing, the seal that bound the wheel to the service of the pharaoh and the protection of the gods. This tiny, hidden mark was the seal of their covenant with the gods. It ensured the wheel would turn true, but it also came with a terrible price, a vow of silence sworn by every member of the guild. For centuries, the circle shapers of Amun ensured Egypt's military dominance, but their very secrecy became their downfall. The knowledge was held by so few, the sacred Izd groves so carefully guarded, that the art was perilously fragile. During the turmoil of the Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos invaders swept across the land with their own advanced chariots, the guild was fractured, masters were killed in the fighting, apprentices were lost, and the sacred groves were desecrated. The invaders couldn't comprehend the Egyptians' methods. They saw it as magic, and they sought to capture it. The invaders brought new technologies, but they couldn't replicate the circle shapers' art. They captured craftsmen, tortured them for their secrets. But the Egyptians had prepared for this. They had one final, desperate defense. The guild's final vow was the right of silence. If a shaper was captured, he was sworn to take his own life rather than reveal the secrets. But more than that, the masters who remained performed one last ritual. They went to the last hidden Izd groves and burned them to the ground, ensuring the sacred wood could never be used by their enemies. They destroyed their own temple workshops, smashed their tools, and scattered to the winds, taking their knowledge with them into obscurity. They chose to let their entire profession die, to erase it from history, rather than let it be corrupted. The soul of their craft was a secret more valuable than life itself. They chose oblivion over capture, ensuring the soul of Egypt's power would never be enslaved. The last master craftsman took the final secret with him, a secret that wasn't about wood, or fire, or even the gods. When Egypt finally rose again, driving out the Hyksos and establishing the new kingdom, the age of warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses the Great, the chariots returned, but they were different. They were heavier, more crudely made, often reinforced with leather or bronze in ways the old masters would have considered an insult. The art was gone. The new craftsmen were merely carpenters, building functional objects, not birthing living things. The memory of the circle shapers faded into legend, their name eventually forgotten. All that remained were whispers of a golden age when chariots flew like the wind, guided by wheels that hummed with a divine song. Archaeologists have found remnants of these later wheels, strong and well made, but occasionally, in the oldest tombs, they find a fragment of something different, a piece of wood that resonates in a way it shouldn't, and they all contain the same baffling anomaly. The final, ultimate secret of the circle shapers was not a ritual, it was a material. When the few surviving fragments of these, First Dynasty, wheels were analyzed with modern technology, scientists found something impossible inside the hubs. At the very center, packed tightly and sealed with resin, was a dense, heavy powder. It wasn't sand or crushed rock. It was a carefully ground mixture of Nile silt, precious gums, and something else, iron. But this was 3,800 years ago, long before the Iron Age. The iron wasn't smelted, its isotopic signature was alien. It was meteoritic iron, iron from the sky. The Egyptians saw it as a literal gift from the gods. This divine, dense core acted as a perfect counterbalance, a gyroscopic stabilizer that gave the wheels their impossible strength and stability at high speeds. The wood, the rituals, the secrecy, it was all to protect the true miracle, a piece of the heavens, hidden at the heart of the circle, a lost profession, whose masters chose to vanish, taking the stars with them.